Welcome to the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in critical times. Here's your host, Bill Kelly.
Welcome to another edition of the Bill Kelly Podcast, critical discussions in these critical times. I'm your host, Bill Kelly. I can't think of too many times, matter of fact, I don't think I can think of any times in the past that I've been in agreement with anything that former Alberta Premier Jason Kenney has had to say on policy issues. Matter of fact, we've had some major disagreements over the years. He goes that way, I go this way, and I think most of Canada goes this way too. But anyway, he did say something on the Sunday political shows that I'm in total agreement with. He was on a panel discussion with Vashi Kapelas on CTV, along with former Ontario Premier Kathleen Wynne. And Kenney said, look, there's going to be a major meeting this week, of course, between the Prime Minister and the Premiers. And Kenney said it's time for the Premiers to put up or shut up. I totally agree. The essence of this, of course, is going to be, I think, one of the major points of discussion at this upcoming meeting. And it's going to be inter-provincial trade, not the global picture. I mean, we all know about the problems and the challenges that we're facing there because of Trump and tariffs and the announcement, of course, just a couple of days ago that he's going to double the tariff on steel and aluminum. Idiot. He doesn't even understand the implications with his own people, but we'll get to that in a second. But one of the other stumbling blocks that the Prime Minister's talked about, and at different times many of the premiers have talked about, is inter-provincial trade. There are trade barriers, there are tariffs, there are restrictions here in this country too. And I get why they're there. That doesn't mean I understand or legitimize them, but it's been going on for years. And Prime Minister Carney said that one of the major things he wants to do at this meeting is to start the ball rolling. As a matter of fact, he's put a timeline on this, which is rather ambitious of him, I guess. He says he'd like to see this whole issue straightened away by Canada Day, which is not that far away. We're into June already now. And that would be a great thing. But it's only going to happen with the cooperation of the premiers and the understanding of the premiers, too. And good on Carney for taking on this role and taking on this challenge. Not the first time, though. This has been an issue for generations in this country. And previous prime ministers, previous premiers in various parts of the country have said, look, we got to do something about this. And they say, yeah, you're right, we do. But, well, okay, what are you going to give up? What are you going to put on the table? And it just fizzles and nothing really happens. And even Kenney, in the show we were just referring to, said he was rather skeptical. He wants to be optimistic about this. I think we all do. But, past indications and past performances by past premiers have always kind of made this whole thing just kind of poof, go up in smoke. This is maybe the time, though, as that panel mentioned, and as we've talked about on the podcast, this is the time that we got to put all these differences aside and say, let's think about Canada first. And that doesn't mean to with your own province. Of course not. The premiers of each province are going to try to do what they can to protect their best interests and the interests of the business and economic entities within their province. I get that. But what Carney is saying, what past prime ministers have also said, and so did Jason Kenney when he was in federal government, is that you can do that, but we have to build a strong Canadian economy. And that's something that's been missing for the last little while, which is why when we get these moronic moves from the White House south of the border, it hurts us especially so because we don't have that strength within the country itself. We've got, of course, oil and gas in Alberta. We've got the lumber industry in British Columbia. We've got auto industry in Ontario. We've got hydroelectric and different places in different parts of the country. And we need to speak as one voice. And Carney has talked about this many times, and I'd like to think that that's going to be the goal of the premiers when they do meet. Good luck with that. But what it's going to mean here is that they're going to have to decide that enough is enough. We need to be stronger within Canada before we can be seen as stronger outside of Canada. And that's not easier. It is easier said than done. But it's already started, and that's interesting. And maybe what has happened here with Trump and these tariffs should maybe underscore that, look, the time is now. Enough of the hand-wringing, enough of the saying, yeah, we'll get around to fixing that sometime. It's got to happen now. Because the situation with Trump is not going to get better anytime soon. So we have to, as Carney has talked about, diversify. And we've got to look for other partners in our trading and maybe even existing partners and just do more with them and try to explore those opportunities. But tear down the provincial barriers that are in place right now. And I'm getting very positive signs. We've all seen and heard positive signs from many of the premiers over the last couple of weeks, which I think is a good sign, even before they all sit around the table for this meeting with the Prime Minister. That's already started, of course. Atlantic Canada, Premier Susan Holt from New Brunswick is encouraging all the maritime provinces to start looking at free trade agreements agreements. They've had discussions with Quebec. Quebec and Ontario have had discussions about this. Doug Ford's talked about this here in Ontario. So it's going on and it's happening. Premier Canoe in Manitoba also having discussions about free trade and reducing, if not eliminating, some of these trade barriers that are going on within provinces. And it hurts us. I mean, we're the consumers, right? And when these barriers come up, tariffs, whatever you want to call them, taxes, geographic omissions in the way some goods are being delivered across the country, as a consumer, you pay more, I pay more. And we need to ease some of the pressure on what's going on now economically in this country. But before we start looking at these other markets and looking outside of Canada, heal thyself. Let's see what we can do within the country. And I'm getting the sense that they're all going in there with that attitude. But the first thing they have to do, how many times have you seen this when, a bunch of highfalutin people, whether it's politicians or whatever, are going to get together? The first order of business is check your ego at the door. And that's one of the things that's going to have to happen at this conference. And I'm getting the sense that you can have both. And the premiers are starting to understand that, you know what, if we have a stronger Canada, it's good for New Brunswick, it's good for Ontario, it's good for BC, and it's good for Alberta too. And I mention Alberta specifically here because with all the stories that we've heard over the last little while, the one province that seems to be standing alone, of course, is Alberta and Premier Danielle Smith out there, who, instead of looking at some sense of cooperation, basically just presented the Prime Minister and said, here's my list of demands. And, if you don't meet these demands, well, we're going to talk about separation, which is a very, very narrow-minded and egocentric way of approaching things. And I know there are elements within Alberta that would love to see that happen. To hell with Canada, and we've heard those stories for generations. I get that. But the fact of the matter is yeah, there seems to be a large and very loud, not so large maybe, but very loud group in Alberta that want to talk about separation or sovereignty or whatever the case might be. But about 71% of the people that are polled said they don't want to have any discussion. They're happy within Canada. They just want to make a better deal. The Premier doesn't seem to want to listen to that 71%. She'd rather play to the vocal minority here because she thinks that's her political base. And that's unfortunate. Because Alberta could benefit greatly from these sorts of discussions that are happening. And I know that, the oil and gas industry has long since looked at this past federal government, I'm talking about the Trudeau government, and said, look, this really tied our hands when it came to the development that we could have and what Canada could have seen. And there's a point to be made there. They are not without some legitimacy in some of these concerns. Pipelines that could have been built and should have been built. I still remember the discussion that Trudeau had some time ago, of course, remember with the German chancellor, and this was just at the beginning of the Ukraine war, and Putin was threatening, and in fact did, basically shut off the supply for fuel to many European countries. And Canada, of course, has liquid natural gas, and we've got to get it to market. And Germany was saying, please do that. And Trudeau basically said, no, there's no economic case to do that. Well, there was, and it never happened. Same sort of thing, of course, with many of the Far East nations right now are looking for Canada to once again be the supplier instead of relying on Russia for their fuel goods. And that's a good thing. It's a good thing to have. But we've got to get the stuff to market. And that's going to mean some discussions about pipelines, and not just the one that's there already, but more pipelines. Now, the Prime Minister has made, I think, a very valid point here, too. He says, yes, pipelines, if there is consensus within the business community and the corporate community. The government, the federal government, which is you and me, we fund the federal government. We can't do that on our own. We can't. We need private sector investment into this. That's the way it's always been, because the costs are, shall we say, significant. So, and I know that, the Alberta counterpoint to that is, well, if you just, reduce or eliminate all the regulations about oil and gas production, that'll bring this investment flowing in here. I don't necessarily know that's the case, because a lot of these companies are already starting to look at the environmental aspect of what's going on here, and they're trying to address that. Maybe not to the degree that the previous government wanted them to, but it is part of the discussion. Basically, check your egos at the door, once again, premiers, and understand that, look, this is a discussion that we have to have. Now, Carney's idea that Canada would be much stronger and much better off if we talked with one economy as opposed to 13. And he's not suggesting that those 13 entities, provinces and territories, simply ignore the fact that they have their own interests. Of course they do. But we also have to look at the national interest. And when you have people like Jason Kenney, who once was the Premier, of course, of Alberta, and other Alberta former premiers and premiers from right across the country, basically, saying that it's about time that we looked at the big picture and stop being protectionist. I understand the wine industry in Ontario would love to see some restrictions on BC wine coming in here and vice versa. But for God's sakes, can we just for once consider that the consumers and the greater Canadian economy has to be factored into this as well? And we want to see that. And negotiations, by definition, mean give and take. You can't just present a list of demands and say, give me all this, give me, or else we're leaving. That's not negotiation. That's not the sense of cooperation. That's not being a partner in Canada and in the Confederation. And we need that. We demand that. And we absolutely must have that sense of cooperation. I don't think anybody expects that this one meeting in Saskatchewan is going to solve all our problems. But there needs to be some honest and open dialogue about this, instead of an us versus them attitude that some premiers still seem to be harboring. That's not helpful. It's not helpful to their own province, and it's certainly not helpful to the greater good here, too. The enemy is in the White House. The enemy is not Ottawa. You've got a new prime minister who says that he's open to discussions, and this meeting, I think, is an opportunity, a great opportunity for him to show the premiers that, okay, we can do this. Yes, there are regulations that were put in place by the previous government that may, in fact, be detrimental to oil and gas production and moving to different markets. Let's have that discussion. I think Carney has indicated that he's willing to be flexible about this, as we do with everything. Don't carve these things in stone. And I think Carney proved that just after he was sworn in as prime minister, after he took over the leadership of the party. First thing he did was to eliminate the carbon tax, the consumer carbon tax. No way in heaven's honor would Trudeau have ever done that, but it was the first thing. And Carney was a supporter, and may still be a supporter of carbon taxing. I know he's written about it before. So have many other people, conservative and liberals, written about the positive impacts of a carbon tax. But Carney justified his move, if you recall, by simply saying, this is not the time. It was a policy then, and it has its place, but given our economic circumstance, it's the wrong policy. So he's shoved that off to the table. That's the kind of mindset that we want from all of our politicians. Forget about your ideology right now. What's best for Canada, and how can everybody around that table work together to make that happen? I share Kenney's skepticism to a certain point, but I also share the optimism that he's shown, that Carney has shown, and that many of the other premiers have shown. It is time, premiers, to put up or shut up and put Canada first. Because if you put Canada first, we all benefit, each province and this country as a whole. That's the attitude. And that's the attitude we all should really want to see happen when these guys get together. That's it for this edition of the podcast. Thanks as always for listening. Of course, you can catch us on, Spotify, YouTube. I mean, we're all over the place. Apple, wherever you get your podcasts, check it out, because there's always lots of great stuff going on. By the way, I should mention too, because we've had some inquiries about this, we also include further reading materials when we post the podcast as well. So don't forget to check that out as you're going along. Thanks as always to Madeline Kelly for the great work putting this one together. I'm Bill Kelly. Until next time, stay in touch and stay informed.
Bill Kelly Podcast brought to you by Wizen's Law, personal injury lawyers. Listen, you didn't choose to get injured, but you can choose the right lawyer. Wizen's Law, 905-522-1102 or wizenslaw.com.